left to their own devices, harbor their aims of Korean unification. Recently obtainable security documents from Russia clearly show that Kim Il-sung is the main instigator of the war, though it is probable that Rhee would have acted in a similar manner, given the opportunity. The tide in the region seems to be running the East's way.
Mao Zedong's self-proclaimed War of National Liberation is a series of battles of annihilation, with talk of a coalition government, a united front, a new democracy. But Mao's promises of popular representation only mask the communist leader's real intentions. Finally, all of mainland China is swallowed up by the so-called liberation movement, and 1/4 of the world's population is brought under communist control.
When the communist Mao Zedong takes power in mainland China in 1949, Kim Il-sung senses his opportunity. He now releases to his allies, in both Moscow and increasingly Beijing, a series of half-truths and half-promises. In Moscow, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, buoyed by the revolution in China, feels anything is possible. Kim Il-sung's hints are now that the United States would not get involved to protect South Korea should an invasion from the north materialize. The new evidence indicates that by early 1950, a conspiracy of allies is beginning to unfold between the North Korean leader, Stalin, and the Chinese leader, Mao Zedong. A consensus forms that an invasion across the 38th parallel is desirable to enable unification. At the 1945 Yalta Conference, Soviet leader Stalin is concerned to create a buffer zone around his country to stop future invasions. To the west, however, this is expansionism in a Europe. Churchill and Roosevelt feel the need for a North Atlantic alliance to block it. This leads, in 1949, to NATO being formed.
On behalf of the government and the people of the United States, I welcome warmly to our country and our capital the foreign ministers who have assembled here to sign the North Atlantic Treaty.
In 1946, senior American diplomat in Moscow, George Kennan, writes a message to Washington that comes to be called the Long Telegram. He sends his analysis of the view from Moscow to the State Department, stressing that the Soviet Union's intentions towards the West are without doubt hostile. The Kremlin, Kennan insists, will yield only to superior force. He advocates a policy of containment of Soviet influence, a term always associated with him. It has a disturbing impact on the US administration. In a speech to Congress in March 1947, President Truman advocates aid to Turkey and Greece in order to repel covert communist advances. But he concludes by saying, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure." The policy that comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine.
Country by country, continent by continent, world revolution follows Mao Zedong's classic conquest of China, dividing the world as a nation is divided into cities and rural areas. In this Red Chinese battle plan, North America and Western Europe are the cities of the world, and Asia, Africa, Central America, and South America, the rural areas. With revolution organized everywhere, there will be a tide of opposition to the free world. And the imperialists will be swept from the stage of history. The communists are waging a guerrilla war patterned after Mao Zedong's War of National Liberation.
The concern over Moscow's intentions has been aggravated in March 1946 when the ex-Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, visits the US. Truman and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, hold him in great respect, so they heartily approve of a speech he makes at Fulton, Missouri. Churchill rails against the danger he sees from communism.
I will venture to be precise. A shadow had fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. According to Churchill and the rising anti-Soviet chorus, the very notion of Christian civilization is at stake.
The might of a free people had come at last to triumph over the lords of war.
The NATO treaty has shown that force would be used in Europe to repel any Soviet push. The carrot for potential wavering countries is $400 million of Marshall Plan money. But the United States also carries a big stick to prove its power to the Soviet Union. Would the same really apply to Southeast Asia? Unlike in Western and Southern Europe, the United States seems unwilling to countenance a military response to northern aggression in Korea. This confusion in American policy on Korea is coming from the Washington administration itself. Acheson expresses reluctance to confront North Korean belligerents in a speech to the National Press Club. He says that American foreign policy does not include protecting by force the independence of South Korea. The countries Acheson would protect by military means run the Pacific Rim between Japan and the Philippine Islands. The remnants of a non-communist China on the island of Formosa, now Taiwan, and South Korea are frankly outside this zone. Acheson says quite bluntly, Korea is not of decisive strategic importance. Budgetary concerns are also influencing US thinking. Commitments are already stretched.
Thus does militant communist China and Mao Zedong see the day when Peking becomes the ideological center of a world enslaved.
Further evidence of a secret plan for a communist invasion of the South unfolds with the build-up of North Korean forces during the winter of 1949. Mainland China is proclaimed the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October, 1949. It begins to send troops to the Yalu River on China's border, where the Korean peninsula meets Asia proper.
Immediately after his visit to Moscow, military arms and equipment began to arrive in North Korea.
Russia, meanwhile, is delivering its famed T-34 tanks, Yak fighters, and other military equipment to the North Korean army. Mao is also moving away from any Western attempts at establishing cordial relations with his regime. After his visit to Moscow in December 1949, he rejects all calls from within his own circle to engage with the West. Instead, he gravitates towards the Soviet Union. Despite receiving a cool reception from a still wary Stalin and the leader's mutual suspicions, the Chinese leader successfully negotiates a pact of friendship and support with Stalin. This Chinese-Soviet treaty, designed to protect their countries from a revitalized Japan, obliges each to come to the aid of the other in the event of an attack from a third party.
United with Russia in war, we strove to preserve that unity and peace. We helped organize the United Nations, in which the nations of the world have mutually pledged to cooperate in fostering world peace and progress. Andrei Gromyko signed for Russia. But in the first post-war Italian elections, the communists created disorder in an attempt to gain control of the government. Once more, the world was reminded that basic in the idea of communism is the plan of world revolution, and that Russian communism has stepped beyond that plan to achieve world domination through aggression.
On January the 30th, 1950, Stalin sends a message to Kim Il-sung offering Soviet support for what he calls his unification project. His army strikes across the 38th parallel on the 25th of June, 1950. With nearly 100,000 troops, armed with some 1,400 military pieces and 126 tanks. The prominent role of Soviet military advisors within the upper reaches of North Korea's high command now makes it inconceivable that the endeavor was not in some way sanctioned by Moscow. The attack is a complete surprise, catching both the South Koreans and the Americans off guard. The Southern Army, having failed to place anti-tank mines, find themselves on the retreat against this blitzkrieg of superior forces. By June the 28th, the North Korean forces even managed to capture the old capital, Seoul. The Korean War begins, the first and only direct military conflict that would go on to involve the superpowers. It also ensures that the theatre of confrontation between capitalist and communist ideologies being played out in Europe is now to extend to Asia. The wholly unexpected invasion reveals a new and highly dangerous escalation of the Cold War.